So frame rates, what are they? Why do they matter? Do they matter? Frame rates is one of my most favorite topics when it comes to filmmaking. And yes, for the record, they do matter. Hey everyone, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Brian. I host this filmmaking behind the scenes show on my channel, and I'm also the co-founder of CK Productions as well. I post videos twice a week, Thursdays and Sundays, and like every YouTuber always says, be sure to like and subscribe. So anyway, getting into the topic of frame rates. Basic kind of definition for frame rates when it comes to video is how many frames are playing on the screen per second. If you don't know this by now, a video itself is just a series of pictures playing after each other and playing so many of those pictures per second. If you make something like a stop motion movie or an animation like that, you're gonna kind of understand the concept of frame rate a little bit better that way. Because you actually have to go frame by frame by frame, making drawings or claymations or whatever. But when you're filming with actual video, you don't have to actually worry about that because the camera just shoots at that many frames, per second. It just makes a video out of it. So the main three frame rates that are shot mostly in video production today are 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. And you use these frame rates for different types of media, different types of video that you're making. And then the first one on the list, and the frame rate I'm shooting right now, is 24 frames per second. 24 frames per second is the standard for film. Films from many years ago have always been shot in 24 frames per second. That is what's known as the film look. And pretty much all professional cameras and a lot of consumer cameras right now can shoot in this format. Any type of movie that you'll see, and most TV shows that are filmed kind of like movies are shot in this format. And since the film looks sort of like a widely sought after look, a lot more productions, a lot more commercials, a lot more just regular, internet videos are shot in 24 frames per second now to kind of emulate that sort of film look. And it adds a little bit air of professionalism to your work. And that's why I like to use it for most of my stuff. And that's why a lot of people like to use it for most of the stuff. People who do understand frame rate, and then if they see your work and they see that it's 24 frames per second, there's automatically in their head, I don't know exactly what it is, but something in their head says, oh, this looks like a movie. So going forward, talking about 30 frames per second. 30 frames per second is sort of that kind of jack of all trades kind of frame rate. It can be used for a variety of different functions. The only type of time you wouldn't use 30 frames per second is for filmmaking, for making films. You can use 30 frames per second, for commercials, for different documentary shows, live television, just regular internet videos and stuff like that. It's a well accepted frame rate for a ton of different formats, and you really can't go wrong using it. A lot of YouTubers will use it, maybe for their vlog videos or stuff like that. I don't personally use it because I like 24 frames better, but also to kind of see the opposite side of that, it does look different than that 24 frames per second look. It looks slightly different, and if you have a kind of a trained eye for it, start watching on your TV and start watching content, start looking for these different frames per second. But also in a sense, since now people are so attuned to 24 frames per second for their film and their TV shows and stuff like that, it's a lot more identifiable when something isn't in that range and it's in something in more of a 30 frames per second. And in some instances, it might honestly look a little less professional if it's shot in that way. But 30 frames per second is still around. I still use it from time to time. I'd say 90% of the time I'm using 24 frames per second, but it's still around and it's still used for certain things. And the last one on the list that we have here is 60 frames per second. Now, 60 frames per second is a little bit different because there's not a lot of delivery formats out there that are done in 60 frames per second. The only delivery formats out there I would say are delivered in 60 frames per second is if it's something like live television, maybe a live broadcast or something, or like a sports game or something like that. A sports game will be shot, about from 60 frames per second to maybe even 90 frames per second. 60 frames per second is what I would describe, and a lot of people describe, as just looking like real life motion. It's the frame rate that kind of represents real life. It's sort of like that soap opera look. While there's not a lot of deliveries that are done, in 60p, 60p is used as a tool to work with other frame rates, because the important thing is if you're going to shoot in, let's say slow motion for your film or video or whatever, you're going to want to shoot in something at least 60p, if not even 120p or beyond that, to get much smoother slow motion. To show, for example here, if I'm moving my arms like this, and I would slow it down a bit, that it looks too choppy, it doesn't look right. But in contrast to that, if I were to shoot this in 60 frames per second like this, you're gonna see my arm motions look smoother there, and it looks a little bit more aesthetically pleasing that way. A good example is the film like 300 or Sherlock Holmes or stuff like that. When they do the super slow motion stuff like that, they're shooting at maybe 1,000 or 300 frames per second for those. They have special cameras called phantom cameras that shoot specifically that frame rate that they use for those films. Some gaming channels or some vlogging channels might deliver their videos in 60p. A lot of video games are in 60 frames per second, so they want to preserve, the frame rate of the game, so they might shoot their content in that way if they're a gaming channel. But what's most important when you're shooting is try to be more conscious of your frame rate. Make that conscious choice when you start your film and don't change from that choice. You have to keep your frame rate consistent throughout, unless you're doing one of those conversions with slow motion or something like that. It's gonna create problems if you have a timeline that's set for 24 frames per second and you're putting 30 frames per second clips on there. It might not be noticeable for some people, but for someone with trained eyes, they're gonna be able to notice, hey, something looks off. It's gonna look a little bit more choppy. You want things to look as smooth as possible, as consistent as possible. It makes things look a lot more professional if you do it that way, and makes things look a little bit more amateur if you don't do it that way. That kind of stuff just kind of drives me crazy. Pick up a camera, look into your settings, and you'll see a whole bunch of stuff for frame rate there. There's tons of different frame rates that cameras shoot at now. It's pretty amazing. Back when I started filmmaking, pretty much all cameras only shot in 24 or 30 frames per second, and they didn't even shoot 4K. And now you can shoot 4K, 60, 120, even 6K, 60. Like it's crazy what you can do now. So that's about all I have to say with frame rates. Again, one of my favorite topics to talk about, and I probably will do more videos in the future about frame rates. And of course, more videos about video production, CK productions behind the scenes, editing, VFX breakdowns, all that kind of stuff for you guys. As always, like I said before, whatever YouTuber says, be sure to like and subscribe, hit that notification bell. I post videos twice a week, Thursdays and Sundays. Also, my Instagram's a thing, so check that out if you'd like. See more of my photography and personal projects on there. With that, I hope you have a nice week, and I'll see you for the next video. Bye, everyone.